A young officer sneered as he circled the rusted Chevy pickup, laughing with his partner. "Looks like we got a real gem here," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. His partner snorted, clearly amused, and leaned on the hood of the squad car. "Wonder if he's got moonshine in that thing," he chuckled. The old driver didn't argue. He kept both hands firmly on the wheel, his eyes steady, silent, and deeply scarred. The only sound breaking the tense stillness was the occasional rattle of the truck's old engine, a sound that seemed to echo the man's own weathered history. Billy Thomas, age 82, had seen far worse than these two officers, but he never let it show. He didn't flinch at their laughter, didn't flinch when the younger cop tapped his flashlight against the side of the truck like it was a toy. It was just another stop. Another day on the road. He'd been through enough of these to know how it would play out. The officers would do their thing, ask their questions, and he'd go on his way. But today wasn't like the others. An hour later, as the officers continued their inspection of the vehicle, a black SUV appeared, cutting through the dust of the sun-baked road. The air changed as soon as the vehicle rolled up, and the officers, who had been laughing just moments before, froze in place. A tall figure stepped out of the SUV. His uniform was immaculate, his gait purposeful. He didn't salute. He didn't need to. Instead, he turned toward the officers, his voice calm but unwavering. "You just stopped the man who trained me." The young officer blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. But the general's eyes were fixed on Billy now, an unspoken recognition passing between them. The officers, once so sure of themselves, exchanged confused glances, unsure of what to make of the situation. The general didn't offer any more explanation. He didn't need to. Billy's presence spoke louder than words ever could. William "Billy" Thomas had always been a quiet man. At 82, his life had been marked by a series of quiet sacrifices, things that no one ever noticed, things he never expected recognition for. Today, however, the quiet would be shattered, though he had no idea. He was simply going about his usual routine. The day had started like any other, with the hum of his old Chevy rattling along the familiar back roads leading to town. He'd made his list, a quick stop at the hardware store to pick up some lumber and screws for Mrs. Johansson's wheelchair ramp, then back home. No fuss, no fanfare. Just a man doing what he'd always done, helping when he could, fixing what was broken, and fading into the background. The old truck was a relic in every sense of the word. Its engine groaned with each gear shift, its body battered by years of hard use, its rusted paint barely holding onto the metal beneath. The dents told stories, each one a marker of a time when Billy had been somewhere, done something, but had never stopped to make a record of it. The truck had been with him for years, just like everything else in his life, reliable, worn, and never looking for attention. It was a perfect reflection of the man behind the wheel. He wasn't a man who wanted to be noticed. He was a man who wanted to work, to serve, and to leave things better than he found them. As Billy turned down the familiar dirt road leading to town, the memories crept in. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, not in fear or anger, but in the weight of it all. He had never been the one to tell war stories. He didn't boast about his time in the Army Special Forces, didn't talk about the years spent in war zones from Afghanistan to Colombia, didn't share the details of the missions that had nearly cost him his life, or the lives of his men. But they were there. In his hands, in his eyes, and in the quiet way he carried himself. Billy had been a part of something larger than himself, something many would never understand. He had trained soldiers, had saved lives in places most people couldn't find on a map, and had been witness to the kind of chaos and violence that changed a person forever. But in the small town where he'd settled after his service, nobody knew that. To them, Billy was just the quiet old man who lived alone and helped out his neighbors when they needed him. He'd rebuilt the wheelchair ramp for Mrs. Johansson because she was too frail to do it herself. He'd repaired the fence for Mr. Rogers down the street. It was just another thing he did because it was needed, and because, in the grand scheme of things, it was all that mattered. Billy hadn't always been this way. When he was younger, there had been a fire in him, a desire to stand out, to lead. But after decades of service, that fire had burned down to embers. He'd come home from war changed, and like so many others, he'd learned that the world didn't have much room for the people who'd sacrificed so much. The recognition had come too late, if it came at all. The medals, the plaques, the words of thanks, they were hollow. They didn't bring back the men he had lost, didn't undo the things he had seen. Billy had tried to build a life outside of all that. He'd married young, had children, but it was never meant to last. His marriage had ended years ago, and his children had long since grown and moved away. He lived alone now, in the same house he'd built with his own hands. It was a small, humble place, surrounded by the hills he'd grown to love. He didn't need much. A roof over his head, food on his plate, and the freedom to live quietly were all he required. But even in his solitude, he never stopped helping. The ramp for Mrs. Johansson, the repairs for the neighbors, those were his acts of service now, the only things that made him feel connected to the world. And so, on this ordinary morning, as he turned into the parking lot of the hardware store, Billy didn't think anything would be different. He grabbed his list from the passenger seat and got out of the truck, stretching his sore legs. The parking lot was nearly empty, the sun high in the sky, the air thick with the smells of fresh-cut wood and hot asphalt. Billy walked inside, a steady, deliberate pace, just as he had 1,000 times before. The young cashier behind the counter didn't look up. She was busy texting on her phone, unaware of the man who'd just walked through the door. Billy didn't mind. He'd never been one for attention. He picked out his supplies and paid in cash, as usual. The clerk barely glanced at him as she handed him his change, and Billy nodded a silent thanks. He made his way back outside, where the sun was beginning to beat down harder. As he loaded his truck, he thought about the ramp he was going to fix for Mrs. Johansson. It wouldn't take long, but it would make a difference. To her, it would mean everything. Billy slid into the driver's seat of his truck, the worn leather creaking under his weight. He turned the key, and the engine sputtered to life. The truck rattled, but it moved forward. That was all that mattered. The road home was short, and there was work to be done. But as Billy merged back onto the highway, the sound of sirens pierced the air, and for the first time in a long while, his calm demeanor faltered. He glanced in the rearview mirror. 2 police cars. Red and blue lights flashing behind him. Billy had been stopped by the police before. It wasn't a frequent occurrence, but it wasn't unusual either. Sometimes they just wanted to check on the old truck, see if it was stolen, or make sure he was obeying the rules. Billy had lived in this town for over a decade, and people knew him, or at least, they thought they did. Most didn't realize who he was, not really. They didn't know his past, the weight of his experiences, the lives he'd saved and lost. And so, when the police stopped him, it was always just a routine check, nothing to be concerned about. This time, however, felt different. The flashing lights in his rearview mirror, the sharp sound of the sirens, the way the officers seemed to circle his truck like vultures, it all had the feeling of something personal. Billy slowed down, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel, his eyes steady on the road ahead. He didn't panic. He never did. He pulled over to the shoulder of the road with the same calm precision he'd used during countless missions in hostile territory, as though it were nothing more than a small obstacle in his day. The 2 officers got out of their squad cars and approached with that same swagger Billy had seen countless times before. One of them, a tall, lean officer with a sharp jawline, was grinning. He was young, maybe in his late 20s, and wore his uniform like it was a badge of honor. His partner, shorter but stockier, walked beside him with a more cautious, almost bored expression. Neither of them seemed to notice the man they were stopping, Billy Thomas, a former Army Special Forces sergeant who had led men in combat, who had saved lives when nobody else could. "Afternoon, sir," the tall officer said, a smugness creeping into his tone as he tapped the hood of the truck with the edge of his flashlight. "What's in the back, old man?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, as though he didn't expect Billy to be able to give a satisfactory answer. Billy didn't flinch. "Wheelchair ramp materials for Mrs. Johansson down the street," he said, his voice steady but carrying a quiet authority that only came from years of training and experience. He knew exactly how to respond to this kind of questioning, calm, direct, never showing weakness. It was the way he'd lived his life for decades. But the officer wasn't satisfied. His grin widened, and he leaned over the truck, peering into the back like he was inspecting contraband, his eyes scanning the lumber and metal, searching for something that wasn't there. "Wheelchair ramp, huh?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'm sure it's not something more interesting." He exchanged a glance with his partner, who chuckled under his breath. Billy's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He knew better than to engage in a back and forth with someone looking for trouble. He kept his hands on the wheel, his posture relaxed but guarded, as though he were a soldier awaiting orders on a battlefield he didn't belong in anymore. The younger officer, emboldened by the lack of resistance, took a step closer. "Maybe you've got something else back there," he said, eyes narrowing. "Something the good OL boys aren't supposed to have. Moonshine, maybe? Or stolen goods?" He let the words hang in the air, the accusation unspoken but clear. Billy remained silent, his eyes never leaving the officer's face. He wasn't angry, not really. But he felt the sting of something deeper, something far more familiar. The disrespect. The assumption that he, just because he was old and his truck was worn down, could be hiding something. It was a feeling he knew all too well from his years in service, when he and his men had been dismissed by outsiders, their sacrifices ignored, their skills misunderstood. He had fought for years to earn respect, and now, standing on the side of the road, it was clear that respect was still a foreign concept to many. The officers began to move around the truck, their eyes scanning every inch of the vehicle, rifling through the bed as though looking for something to pin on him. Billy could hear them making comments under their breath, more insults, more mockery, but he didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew the game they were playing. They were trying to provoke him, trying to get a reaction so they could escalate things further. But Billy wasn't the kind of man who gave people the satisfaction of seeing him lose his composure. It was then that Billy noticed something, a figure standing on the corner of the street, watching them with quiet intensity. The person didn't approach, didn't call out or intervene. They simply watched. It was an old man, wearing a faded jacket and a cap. Billy didn't recognize him at first, but something about the man's posture told him that he was no stranger to the world Billy had come from. Billy's eyes flicked back to the officers. They hadn't noticed the observer yet, too caught up in their own small moment of power. The officer with the flashlight continued his inspection of the truck, muttering more sarcastic comments as he poked through the tools and materials in the bed. The air between them thickened, and Billy could feel the tension building. He wasn't going to let them provoke him. He had been through much worse, he knew how to keep his cool. But then, just as things seemed ready to escalate, the old man on the corner shifted. Billy's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, the two shared a look. It was a look that said more than words ever could. The old man knew exactly who Billy was. There was no judgment, no question in his eyes, just recognition. Billy nodded slightly, an unspoken acknowledgement that he was being watched, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something stir inside him, a sense of dignity, of pride, that he hadn't realized he was missing. Just as the younger officer was about to ask another question, a deep rumble of tires rolling over gravel interrupted him. The sound was heavy, purposeful, like the rumble of an approaching storm. The SUV appeared on the horizon, its black silhouette cutting through the haze of the afternoon sun. The officers froze, the sudden arrival of the vehicle pulling them out of their petty game. Billy turned his head, his eyes narrowing just slightly as he watched the SUV slow to a stop. The officers didn't know it yet, but the man they had just mocked was about to be recognized in a way that would make them wish they had never spoken a word. The man in the SUV was someone they could never have expected. The black SUV rolled to a slow stop in front of Billy's truck, its tires crunching the gravel beneath them with a deep, resonating sound. The air around them seemed to shift, charged with something electric, as though the arrival of the vehicle had changed the entire atmosphere. The younger officer was the first to react. He straightened up quickly, eyes flicking between Billy, the SUV, and the tall man who was stepping out of it. The officer's hand instinctively went to his holster, but he didn't draw his weapon. Instead, he watched with a mix of confusion and wariness, unsure of what was happening. The man who emerged from the SUV was a stark contrast to everything Billy had experienced in the last few minutes. Tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably groomed, he wore his uniform with an air of authority that immediately commanded attention. He didn't speak at first, his gaze sweeping over the officers with a sharpness that seemed to cut through the tension like a knife. He didn't acknowledge Billy right away either, his attention was focused solely on the two officers, who were now standing straighter, clearly unsettled by his sudden arrival. Billy, for his part, had known that the situation was about to change, but he couldn't have predicted this. He had no idea who this man was, but something in the way he moved, the confidence, the quiet power, told him that this was no ordinary visitor. The officer who had been mocking Billy just moments ago shifted uncomfortably on his feet. He stepped forward, but he did so with caution, a hint of unease creeping into his demeanor. The general's eyes, however, never left the officers. "Which of you stopped this man?" he asked, his voice low but unmistakably firm. There was no anger in it, no rage, just the calm certainty of someone who had seen too much to waste time with nonsense. The young officer, caught off guard by the question, glanced nervously at his partner, unsure how to respond. We were following protocol, sir," the officer mumbled, his earlier bravado quickly fading into confusion. "He's just an old man, driving a rundown truck. We were just checking to see what he's carrying." The general's eyes never wavered from the officer's face. He seemed to consider the words for a moment, but there was no hint of forgiveness in his gaze. "Is that all? Following protocol?" His voice was quieter now, almost conversational, but it carried weight that made the air around them feel heavier. "Do you know who this man is?" The officer opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked back at Billy, whose face remained unreadable, his eyes steady but unfazed by the scrutiny. The general didn't give him time to respond. He stepped closer to Billy's truck and turned his gaze toward the old man sitting inside. "Let me make one thing clear," the general continued, his voice now gaining strength as he addressed the officers. This man right here, is William Thomas. A legend. A hero. And you two just made the biggest mistake of your careers." The officers blinked, their confusion deepening, but there was no mistaking the power in the general's words. Billy didn't react, not in the way they expected. He didn't rise to the occasion with a speech or a boast. Instead, he simply sat there, watching quietly, his hands still on the steering wheel. He had never needed anyone to speak for him, and he wasn't about to start now. The general wasn't finished. He looked at the officers and then back at the growing crowd of onlookers, who had gathered at the edge of the street, drawn by the noise and the tension. The crowd had been watching from a distance, but now they began to murmur among themselves, the whispers carrying through the warm air. A few people had taken out their phones, recording the scene unfolding before them. It wasn't just a traffic stop anymore, it was a spectacle. A moment of reckoning. The general, sensing the shift in the crowd, raised his voice just enough to carry to them. "In 1982, Sergeant Major Thomas here was the man who taught me everything I know about leadership," he said, his tone strong, his words clear. "He was the one who taught me how to lead men through battle, how to survive when everything seemed lost. And he was the one who saved my squad during a training mission. He kept us alive when we had no business being alive." The crowd went silent, their murmurs fading as they processed the words. The general's voice rang out again, more forceful now. In 1986, Sergeant Major Thomas led a recon mission in Colombia. It was a mission that no one thought would succeed. But he didn't give up. He didn't stop. And because of him, 23 hostages were freed from a drug cartel's grip. Do you understand the weight of that? The crowd was no longer just watching. People were stepping closer, some craning their necks to hear better. A few of the older men and women recognized the name, the history, the weight of the general's words. Billy Thomas, the quiet, unassuming man in the old truck, was someone they'd heard about in passing. But the full extent of his story, the years of service, the sacrifices he had made, they were just now beginning to sink in. A nurse stepped forward from the crowd, her voice hesitant but steady. "He's donated blood every month for 25 years, she said, her words carrying through the air. "He's helped more people than anyone could ever count." A retired teacher, an older woman with graying hair, added her voice next. I remember when he helped my husband after his stroke," she said, her eyes watering slightly. "He didn't ask for a penny. He just came and built the ramp so my husband could get outside again. That's who he is." Billy could hear the shifting tides in the crowd, the slow change from disbelief to recognition, from mockery to respect. The officers, who had once mocked him, now stood silently, their eyes cast downward. Their earlier swagger was gone, replaced by the weight of realization. Billy sat still, his hands resting on the wheel, and he allowed himself the rare luxury of letting the moment unfold around him. This was his story, but it had never been about him. It had never been about the medals or the recognition or the applause. It had always been about doing the right thing, about serving when no one was looking, about standing tall in the face of challenges even when it seemed like no one else cared. Now, for the first time, people were starting to understand that. The general's words hung heavy in the air, reverberating through the crowd, each syllable landing like a slow drumbeat, a reminder that Billy Thomas was no ordinary man. The officers remained silent, their faces unreadable now, their earlier bravado stripped away by the sheer force of the moment. The crowd, once curious and skeptical, now stood in stunned silence, processing the weight of the man before them. Billy, for his part, didn't flinch. He didn't move. He simply sat there, an unyielding presence in the face of this sudden shift in attention. The wind picked up slightly, stirring the dust in the street as people began to step closer, their eyes fixed on the scene before them. The general stood with his back straight, his voice steady as he continued to speak. "This man," he said, gesturing toward Billy, "is the kind of leader this country was built on. He's the kind of man who ran recon missions in jungles, deserts, and mountains, often without backup, often without recognition. He did what needed to be done, not for medals or glory, but because it was the right thing to do." He paused, letting the crowd absorb his words, watching as the realization began to settle over them. Billy wasn't just a retired soldier, a quiet old man in a truck. He was a legend, someone whose name had been whispered in hushed tones in military circles, a man whose actions had saved lives and changed the course of history. And yet, in the small town where he now lived, few had ever truly seen him for what he was. A voice from the crowd broke the silence, a man in his 50s with a weathered face and an air of recognition. He stepped forward, his voice shaking. "I remember you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was just a kid, maybe 10 or 11, when you came through town. My father was in the army, and you trained him." He looked at Billy with a mixture of awe and reverence. "I heard the stories. How you saved his platoon when they were trapped. How you never asked for anything in return. But no one ever told us who you really were." He paused, swallowing hard. "Thank you. Thank you for everything." The crowd murmured again, a ripple of understanding passing through them. The man's words, simple as they were, carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of gratitude. Billy didn't respond, didn't move, but the slight tilt of his head was all the acknowledgement he would offer. He didn't need thanks. He didn't need recognition. His service had always been about something deeper than the applause of others. But in that moment, he allowed himself to feel the sting of appreciation, something that had been missing from his life for so long. Another figure stepped forward, this time a woman in her 60s with glasses perched on the edge of her nose. "I remember when my husband had his stroke," she said, her voice strong but edged with emotion. "You came right over. Built that ramp for him yourself." She shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. "Never once did you ask for anything. Not money, not praise. You just did it. Because it was needed." Billy glanced at her, his gaze steady but warm, acknowledging her words without speaking. The woman smiled faintly, and for a moment, there was a quiet understanding between them. It wasn't about the ramp, or the wheelchair, or the work. It was about something more, something far deeper. It was about dignity, respect, and the quiet way in which Billy had lived his life, always giving, always serving, never asking for anything in return. A younger man, no older than 30, stepped forward next. His uniform, though civilian, was clearly military in origin. "Sergeant Major," he said, his voice thick with admiration. "I was in the army for 6 years, served in Iraq. I was part of a unit that got pinned down in Fallujah in '05. We were outgunned, outmanned, and out of options. But we got out because of you. You taught me and my unit everything we knew about surviving in hostile territory." The man's voice cracked slightly as he continued. "We didn't always understand it back then, but now we know. You saved us." Billy nodded once, a slight acknowledgement, but nothing more. He had never been one for grand speeches, and he wasn't about to start now. His legacy wasn't about words, it was about actions. It always had been. The general, who had been silently watching the growing recognition, turned back to the officers. The younger officer, who had been so eager to mock Billy just moments ago, stood with his head bowed now, clearly embarrassed, clearly humbled by the turn of events. His partner, the stockier one, stood beside him, shifting uncomfortably. The general's voice cut through the quiet air again, like a knife through soft fabric. "I suggest you take a long, hard look at who you've just stopped," the general said, his voice no longer loud, but firm and unyielding. "You've just made a fool of yourselves, and you should be ashamed. This man here, has done more for this country than most people will ever understand. And yet you treated him like a criminal." The officers remained silent, their eyes still fixed on Billy, their faces reddening with the weight of the general's words. It was a moment of reckoning, one they could not ignore. The crowd had witnessed it all, the arrogance, the mockery, the sudden shift to humility. And in that moment, they saw what Billy had known all along, that respect wasn't earned through titles or uniforms, but through deeds. The general turned back to the crowd, his voice calm but filled with authority. "Sergeant Major Thomas isn't just a name in a history book. He's the embodiment of what it means to serve. To sacrifice. To lead by example. And if you ever forget that, just remember today." The crowd nodded, their eyes now filled with a mixture of admiration and regret for not seeing Billy for who he truly was sooner. The general gave a final, respectful nod to Billy before turning to leave, but not before giving one last look at the officers. Without saying another word, he returned to the SUV, and the vehicle roared to life once more. Billy remained in his truck, his hands still resting on the wheel, watching as the general's SUV pulled away. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but the feeling in the air lingered. Billy's truck, battered and old, sat quietly in the middle of the street, no longer just a relic of the past, but a symbol of something far greater. As the officers began to shuffle away, their heads down in shame, Billy drove off, his truck rattling down the road once more. This time, though, people didn't just see an old man behind the wheel, they saw the legend. The streets weren't just empty anymore. People stepped aside when they saw him, not out of fear, but out of respect. Billy's truck rumbled down the street, the familiar groan of the engine accompanying him as he drove away from the scene that had changed everything. The moment he had been an unspoken part of, the recognition he had long deserved, lingered in the air like an aftertaste. It was strange, almost surreal. For the first time in years, people weren't just looking at him as the quiet old man. They were seeing something more, something deeper, something he had long buried beneath years of routine. The drive home wasn't long, but as Billy approached his house, he couldn't shake the weight of the events that had just unfolded. The day had begun like any other, routine, unremarkable, but now, his truck wasn't just an old workhorse. It was something else entirely. He had never wanted recognition for his actions, never sought out any glory. But now, as he turned into his driveway, his eyes lingered on the small street where he had lived for years, quiet, unassuming, the kind of place where people came and went without much notice. But not today. Not anymore. As the truck came to a stop, Billy's hand hovered over the ignition, but he didn't turn the key right away. He sat there for a moment, just listening. The wind whispered through the trees, the faint hum of life around him, the quiet of his own small world. The house before him had seen its fair share of history. He had built it himself after coming back from his service, brick by brick, just as he had rebuilt his life after every mission, every loss. It wasn't much, just a small house on a quiet street, but it had always been home. And it had always been enough. The neighbors, those who had watched him for years and knew him by name, hadn't seen the man they had just seen that afternoon. To them, Billy was just the elderly man who helped when needed, who kept to himself, and who never asked for anything. They didn't know the stories of the jungles, the deserts, or the mountains he had traversed. They didn't know the lives he had saved or the sacrifices he had made. But now, after the general's words had pierced through the silence of the town, they would. They would remember the man behind the truck. They would remember the name, Sergeant Major William Thomas. Billy shut off the engine and stepped out of the truck, his boots hitting the gravel driveway with a soft thud. He stretched his legs, feeling the weight of his age in his bones, but it wasn't the physical tiredness that lingered. It was the emotional weight of the years. The weight of duty. The weight of things that were never said, never acknowledged, and perhaps never needed to be. He had always known that the work he did was more important than the recognition, but today, something had shifted. People had seen him. They had understood. They had recognized what he had spent his life doing. Billy made his way to the front door, his movements slow but deliberate, like a man accustomed to long days of hard work. As he walked, he noticed the neighbors peeking from their windows, the ones who had watched the scene unfold, the ones who had witnessed the moment of truth. They hadn't stepped forward earlier, hadn't said anything, but now they were watching him. And that was enough. They didn't need to say anything. The respect in their eyes was enough. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, the familiar smell of wood and old furniture greeting him. The house was simple, just like the life he had chosen to lead. A worn sofa sat in front of a small television, a few framed photographs from his time in the service hanging on the walls. There were no medals on display, no grand reminders of the battles he had fought. His awards were buried in a box in the attic, out of sight, out of mind. They didn't matter. Not really. What mattered was what he had done, not what he had been given. Billy went into the kitchen and poured himself a cup of coffee, his hands steady, his mind racing through the events of the day. He didn't want to dwell on the recognition, didn't want to make it bigger than it was. But even he couldn't ignore the ripple it had caused. The general had said it plainly, this wasn't about Billy's past. It was about respect. It was about the kind of respect that didn't require a badge or a uniform. It was about the kind of respect you give someone simply because they've earned it, because they've shown through their actions that they are worthy of it. There was a knock at the door. Billy set the coffee down on the counter and walked slowly to answer it, his boots echoing on the wooden floors. When he opened the door, there stood Mike Henderson, the older man who had been watching the whole situation unfold on the street corner. Mike wasn't one to make a scene, but Billy could tell he had been moved by what had happened. Mike nodded to him, his eyes tired but kind. "I just wanted to say, Billy," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "you've done a lot for this town. A lot more than anyone knows. I wanted you to know, you've got more respect around here than you think." Billy studied him for a moment, then nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thanks, Mike," he said simply. He didn't need any more words. Mike was right. The town had always respected him in its own quiet way. But now, they would remember him. Not just as the man who helped with the ramp or fixed the fence, but as something more, something far greater. Mike smiled faintly before turning to leave, but Billy stopped him. "You've helped enough, Mike," Billy said, his voice softer now. "Sometimes, you just need to let people see the truth." Mike turned back and gave a slow nod, his lips curling into a small, understanding smile. "I think they've seen it, Billy. I think they've seen it." As Mike walked back down the street, Billy stood in the doorway for a moment longer, looking out at the town. The quiet was no longer just silence, it was filled with something else. A quiet understanding, a new recognition of the man he had always been. He didn't need the applause, the medals, or the grand gestures. He had done his part. And now, his legacy was written in the hearts of those who had seen beyond the surface. Billy closed the door softly, but the truth was clear. Today, he wasn't just the man in the truck. Today, he was a legend, and legends don't fade. Respect earned.